last month I got married, and we have a baby on the way. So and I'm getting my house together. My YouTube channel's taken off, and it's working out really well.
It's an amazing story. I love your YouTube channel where you go in depth on individual topics. You talk a little bit about um, the RDU, and then you talk about being in the hole, and also your education opportunities in prison. And there's just so many different topics, and I could just ask you a million questions. But if I could just ask you to begin with, what would you say are some misconceptions people have about prison life, that just an outsider who doesn't know anyone who's been to prison, they don't work in a prison, they just hear about it on TV or something? What do you think that they're missing?
One of the biggest misconceptions is that prisoners don't have a life. They just sit in their cells all day and don't do anything. And the only thing they do is go out to yard and lift weights. That's something that I've run into a lot, and that's not true. You have a job in prison. You can go to school in prison. You can play music. You can do concerts. You can teach classes, take classes, be involved in nonprofit organizations. There is so much to do in prison. So that's one of the things that I would say is wrong about, prison, that a lot of people say. Another thing I would say is gang life in prison, and that it's always this rough, tough environment. That's not the case. There's a lot of times in prison where you can hang out with your buddies, you can have fun, you can celebrate birthdays, you can watch a football game together. There are a lot of good times in prison. Some of the best times of my life have been in prison, which is weird, but it's true. Uh, there's it's not always about that gang life, and you don't have to join a gang when you immediately come to prison. If you join a prison gang, really all that does is change the people that you're fighting with. One way or another, you're going to have to fight. But if you join a gang, then you have to worry about infighting. You have to be told what to do and when you're going to do it, and whose head you're going to have to bust. And it doesn't need to be that way.
I didn't know that the Aryan Brotherhood had a big presence in Kansas. I'd known that they had a huge presence in California, but I guess they kind of spread their chapters all over the place. Were there any other gangs that were fighting with the Aryan Brotherhood?
Yeah, there were several gangs that were fighting with the Aryan Brotherhood. And it's weird. Guys will go do time in other states. Let's say an inmate stabs someone in Kansas. The prison here will put them on interstate compact and send them to another state. Well, if you go to a state like Arizona or California, something like that, where they have a lot of Aryan Brotherhood guys, then they'll come back and they'll be a member, and they'll try to sanction a new chapter here. And that's actually what happened. Um, some guys claim to have been to Arizona. They claim they were Aryan Brotherhood. They came to Kansas and they tried to set up a chapter here. But where they really messed up is they tried to tell the other white gangs in the Kansas system that, they were in charge. In Kansas, you have several white gangs like the Ossetrews, the Raw Boys, the Peckerwoods. They're all white gangs that like to be independent. They like to control themselves. So when the ABs showed up and they tried to tell those guys what to do, oh man, it ignited a war. And yeah, there's been a lot of violence between the ABs and other white gangs in Kansas for a long time.
Yeah, I've heard of the Ossetrews. It's kind of like an Odin Norse gods kind of
Yeah,
identity. Do they actually adhere to that, or am I misunderstanding?
some people do. For some people, Asatru is a legitimate religion and they're sincere about it. There are people who practice the Asatru religion out here in the free world, and they don't use it as a racial thing or a gang thing or anything like that. But in prison, a lot of religious groups are turned into a gang. And the Ossetrus in prison, it's one of those groups. They'll use it as a white gang, And I'm not saying all the members of the Asatru religion in prison are racist or gang members, but that a lot of the guys, the majority of them, they will use that as a gang. So, uh, and a lot of them don't even adhere to the principles of the religion. They just want the power trip of being in a big gang.
Yeah, so your degree you went to college while you were in prison is in theology. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have a master's degree in theology, and my doctorate is in religious education. So I think I began studying in, I want to say 2009. And in 2009, my father died. So I kind of just stopped for a while and I started back up, but I didn't finish my college work until the year I got out. But it was a lot of work. I couldn't do your typical exams or anything like that while I was in there because there was no way I could have someone present to oversee that, but I could write papers. And so I went to a school that would allow me to write papers, and I could do that for myself. I bought a typewriter and I would constantly be typing away on that thing, and it was a lot of work. It was definitely a lot of work, but it was very rewarding. I guess my motivation behind a lot of it, as far as the religious aspect of it, I've always felt, especially in prison, you have guys that are from all walks of life. You'll see guys that are Muslims, guys that are Buddhists, people that are Asatrus. You're in there with everybody. And I always felt that if you understood somebody's religious beliefs or their spirituality, that you could understand the principles that they live by more. You could understand their culture a little bit more. And I've always wanted to understand people. And that was a big part of my motivation. And another thing was, I mean, some of the bigger colleges, they're way too expensive for an inmate. That's very, very hard to swing. And the college that I went to, CBCS, it was still expensive, but it was something that I could manage. My aunt passed away while I was in prison. I think she passed away the same year I started, and she left me a little bit of money, and I used that to pay off the money on my house uh, that my mom was living in at the time, and I used that to you know pay for my college tuition and my textbooks. So that was that was kind of a blessing there.
In the video where you talked about your education, how you got your doctorate, you mentioned that there was a counselor or the woman that was in charge of assigning people to GED programs and things, and that she had let you take your test many times, or she let you take the test,
Mm-hmm.
and you got perfect scores, and
Yeah.
so they didn't know if they should make you wait to finish your GED or let you in. Do you
Right.
think that there are people in the system that can have a positive impact on people just by giving them a chance, or thinking of them instead of just thinking of them as a number or someone coming in the office, that to give them an opportunity? How can individuals in the system help prisoners?
Well, people in prison are people. Guys. I mean, people make mistakes. I've seen people from all walks of life end up in prison, but it doesn't mean that there's something to be discarded. It doesn't mean they don't have anything to offer. And sometimes it takes someone like a counselor or a teacher or something like that to see their potential, recognize it, and give them that encouragement and tell them, hey, you can do this and facilitate that. Miss Boyer, the lady that helped me with my GED, she gave me that opportunity. They didn't want to let me take the test for the GED, or it was actually at the time in Kansas, it was a high school diploma. They did away with calling it a GED, even though it was basically the same thing. Um, they weren't supposed to give me that opportunity. It was too far out for me. I had a long sentence, and they didn't want to let that happen. But she gave me that opportunity. I took the practice test. I showed them that I could do it, and I was grateful for that opportunity. Stuff like that, it's only going to help people. If you let guys take a test to get a high school diploma or learn anything else, you're not hurting them. Would you like someone to go through, 11 years thinking that they can't do something? And so I'm just going to go over here and I'm going to hang out with these guys in the weight pit and get in fights and all this stuff. Or am I going to believe something good about myself and have that belief in myself and that motivation to go do something? And granted, there's a large element of that is in the individual, but the people that work in prisons have so much power to do good things for people and make a positive change, not just in individuals, but in the environment as a whole. If you have a prison that's full of people that are trying to do something better with their lives, it's a lot better place to live and work than a prison that's chaotic and violent. So by giving people opportunities, by kind of giving them that validation or helping them with that validation, telling them that they can change, they can do something good with their lives. It might not seem like a lot, but when a guy has nothing and he's living in a concrete cell, he's looking at all the bad things that he did in his life, and somebody who's coming in from the free world is telling them, you can do something good with your life. You can change. That that can change their whole perspective. That can change their life.
I guess maybe the other side of that is that they can also do a lot of damage. That if you had someone who wanted to abuse their power or hurt
Absolutely.
somebody, that there's just the power differential is you could just really keep someone down. You could destroy them in there. Was there much in by way of corruption that you saw, or just people abusing their power?
Absolutely, especially when it comes to retaliation. A lot of times, if an inmate would do something that an officer didn't like, that officer, they might be a low-ranking officer, just a CO1 or something like that. But if they're friends with someone in administration or EAI or SST or something like that, one of these other divisions of the prison, they can cause a lot of problems for you. You can lose your level. You can have, you can be set up essentially. Um, you can lose contact with your family. You can lose your visits. You can find yourself transferred to another prison. And if you have something good going on, that's devastating. It really is. I actually had a time, I was in the JCs. I said that before. I was a business vice president. And some of the officers didn't like that we were doing so many things, that we had these classes going. We had a sewing project going on. We sold food to visitors out in visitation. We had all these things that we were doing, and we were out of ourselves a lot, had a lot of movement around the facility. And an officer came into my cell, and I'm usually not one to not accept responsibility for my actions, but this is the one time where it really wasn't my fault. I had hobby craft items in my cell, and I had what's called a head pin. It's a small metal pin used for making jewelry. But I actually had a pack of 150 of them, and it was approved by the activities department. I had these head pins in a bag along with my approval receipt. It had the activity specialist signature on it and everything else. I got shook down because there were people in administration that were mad about what we were doing. And the guy from SST comes in, he takes one of those head pins out of this bag, ignores the other 149 that I had, ignores the receipt from the activities department, and he wrote me up for having a tattoo needle. Even though I didn't have any new tattoos, my cellie didn't have any new tattoos, never been under investigation for doing tattoos, anything like that. And they found me guilty on that for dangerous contraband. And it was crazy. It could have derailed everything because dangerous contraband is an R1 write up in Kansas, which means you go straight to max security. I went and talked to my unit team about it. My unit team manager, the staff that's basically in charge of your programs and your housing and stuff like that. When talked to her about it, I said, look, you know who's doing stuff in your cell house who isn't supposed to be doing stuff. You know, I never cause problems. I never start stuff. I'm not doing tattoos. You know that. And she said, yeah, I know. I never have any problems with you. I don't get any complaints from officers. And I said, so what are we going to do? And she said, well, I'm not going to drop your level and I'm not going to make this an R1DR. She said, I'm going to amend it. Just stay out of trouble for the next 8 months and it will, it won't be any problem whatsoever. But yeah, so stuff like that happen all the time. People use their power for, the wrong thing. I saw black suits in the infirmary. I worked in the infirmary in El Dorado for a while. And black suits basically beat a man to death. They flipped a table over on top of a guy and broke his skull essentially, and the dude died. And there was no accountability for that. So it can be physical abuse of power, or something like mine where they just kind of set you up, or like if you're filing legal paperwork against people, uh, staff, people in administration or unit teams or anything like that, they will send you to different prisons around the state. They'll send you to a different prison every few weeks so you can't file that paperwork, because in court there's a deadline for most things, and a lot of times if you get transferred to another prison, they'll conveniently lose your paperwork. um, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff they do that shouldn't be done.
That's terrible. We talked to a internal affairs prison inspector earlier in my course, and he was telling us quite a lot about just how bad the corruption can be and how they really aren't held accountable or punished. And it's a real shame. I think that's probably one area that, my students, if they end up working in the correction system, is something they should look into, is how to hold people more accountable and try to keep things fair.
Absolutely. Yeah, the corruption goes all the way to the top. Sometime it might interest you to look up a guy named Joe Norwood and the legal problems he had recently. They built a newer part of the prison out at Lansing, where I was housed for a while. Joe Norwood was our Secretary of Corrections, and he was involved with the company that made the contract to build that prison. So there was a huge conflict of interest there. And he ended up having to resign for that because he was making money from this prison being built. And he was the one who secured the contract for DOC.
That's horrifying. It's, if prisons were meant to try to keep society safe or somehow help people, that'd be one thing. But when you see things like that, the corruption, it definitely makes you question why we have so many prisons and so many people serving such long terms. It's really frustrating. I was going to ask you, if so, you served 11 out of 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that if they had given you a shorter sentence, that it would have had the same effect of, punishing you, scaring you, deterring you from any future criminal behavior? How long do you think would have been good that you would have learned your lesson and never done anything again?
I think that had I gone for a very short sentence, like 3 years or something like that, I don't think it would have made a huge difference. But I think after about 7 or 8 years, I was ready to go home. After that, I don't think there was any more benefit to me being there. It was, matter of fact, the last 2 years, I was in SEG and in a mental health unit. If anything, it did more damage than good. I think a lot of that has to do with my personal choices while I was in there, though. I I grew a lot because of what I was involved in, but that wasn't mandated to me. That wasn't something the prison said I had to do. I chose to be involved in positive things. So I know guys that have been down for the same amount of time, maybe longer, and they're knuckleheads because they went a different way. They didn't get involved in positive stuff. They decided to get involved with gangs and things like that. I think the biggest difference that could be made isn't necessarily the amount of time that you spend there, it's what you're involved in. And I feel like if prisons did more to encourage people to be involved in positive things, it would be a huge difference.
That's one thing I'm actually going to teach my students about this week is about the reentry programs and all the rehabilitation programs that are available. In some states, either they just don't allocate the money to it, so there aren't enough resources for good programs, or they reserve them only for people who are about to leave. So it doesn't help people who are first coming in. Like you said, you might not even have been eligible for high school classes because you had a long sentence. They want you to wait until you're about to leave before you take it, and just seems so counterproductive.
Very. There's so little that's done for the duration that you're there. Reentry, you should prepare for reentry the day you get there. The process of getting out doesn't happen 6 months before you leave or a year or 2 years before you leave. Preparing to get out starts when you set foot in that prison. From the time I got there to the time I left. Now, I did some stupid things. I'm not saying I didn't, but I steadily made progress. I was trying to better myself and do something good with my time, but not because someone else made me. There are programs like I had to go through a vocational course. I had to learn a trade. I wasn't eligible for that until I had 5 years or less. The high school diploma, I wasn't eligible until I had 5 years or less. And a lot of programs are like that. And I don't think it should be that way. The other thing is, the programs aren't available for every inmate. There are a lot of programs that are only available if you plan on getting on disability when you get out, or if you have a drug case, or something like that, or if you have less than $500 on your books. I don't think that should be a factor. I really don't think how much money you have on your books should be a factor in getting assistance in getting out of prison, especially if you've been in for a while. That's rough. And even with your case, everybody who's getting out of prison, they're going to need help. That's just the way it is. You can't do any amount of time and be ready without.
Right.